Well, welcome back to another episode, this time on the Miles Driven. It's sports cars. And you know what? You don't normally do a list of sports cars based on depreciation. It's usually always about performance or how they make you feel, how they drive down the road, how they go around a track. But since we've been doing this series of depreciation, we've done EVs, SUVs, luxury cars. And I thought, you know what? There are some great sports cars out there that most people just won't consider because they think just price is too high. They've got that list price in their mind of what they would know. And they might be a bit, I wouldn't say too surprised. Sports cars do hold their money better than ever before because basically they're not being made really much anymore. No one really buys them, unfortunately. But they do still have some pretty good depreciation in that first 3 to 5 years. And when you start looking at around that 8-year marker, that's where there can be some real bargains to be had because you get the car just before it sort of slips out of the hands into people that maybe are willing to just sort of drive it hard and not service it. But you get it while it's still hopefully been either dealer serviced or specialist serviced. Now, that's not to say you can't find 10, 15-year-old examples of sports cars that haven't been fantastically treated, but generally speaking, you want to get one that is as new as possible. And so there are a few cars on this list that I've gone slightly newer because of when the chassis started to be built. And I think there's one exception going one way, one exception going the other. And it will be obvious as I go through the list how I've decided it. And it's number 1 and I think number 9 on the list. I've decided to go one old generation, one new generation. Let's kick off. And the first car on the list. Now, I've gone true sports car as I can throughout. Okay. But, you know, what is a sports car? What can be classed as a sports car? It all sort of goes around. But I think this first one, there's no way you can class it as anything but a sports car. It is the Toyota GR Supra that came out. It's the A90 chassis. It came out in 2019. Now, at launch, officially it's 335 brake horsepower, goes up to an official 382. Seeing dyno runs of these, power seem to be stronger than 335 from factory. I would say because of depreciation, the early ones are still going to be pretty pricey. Okay, we're only looking at 5, 6-year-old cars, bearing that in mind. So 40% depreciation in the UK, 35% depreciation in the USA. And I was surprised at first, usually because the US is a bigger market and because there are just more out there. And obviously you can get cars shipped from state to state. And because they've all got mile-per-hour speedos and they're left-hand drive, you have a bigger market to pick from. Whereas in the UK, we have a smaller market, which sometimes helps us because right-hand drive cars will depreciate a bit heavier compared to European cars, but then it goes the other way sometimes as well. So I thought that potentially we'd be seeing at the right-hand drive models, the ones in the UK, would suffer a bit, especially because we can bring in Japanese imports in this country. And I thought maybe that might have had an impact, but no, it seems that because the car is a world car, for whatever reason, I'm going to hazard a guess. I had a quick look on this, but I couldn't get anything concrete. But I think, generally speaking, it's the community around the car. That's kind of what I've narrowed it to. There is a community in the UK that loves Supras, but it's a bigger community in the US. There's a higher number of people over there that are modifying their cars, customizing, finding extra power from the engine. And there's also, I think, a bigger knowledge base over in the US for the Supra because, again, people are willing to spend the money to pump up the power, to get more performance from the car. And so you've got more shops that are sort of dedicating off to the Supra. Whereas in the UK, yes, we know the B58 engine very, very well because it's in so many BMWs. But the general community, seeing a Supra is pretty rare. And I live in an area of the world where, there's lots of press cars that drive around and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, you really don't see them. So that's the Supra. That's the first on the list. Now, the second on the list should surprise absolutely no one. This is the quintessential sports car of yesteryear. It is the definition in many ways of what a sports car should be. Not a supercar, but a sports car. No, it's not a Porsche 911 because, that's about me pushing it a little bit, especially because I'm trying to keep the price range as realistic for many of you as possible. It's the Mazda MX5, or Miata, as you may have known it in previous generations. It's the ND generation, so this is the current generation. They're still selling this brand new from Mazda. And if you look for a 2017 model with a 2-litre engine, now, because of the power options and the engine options, you can go from 155 up to 181 brake horsepower, but I'd be looking at a 2-litre model. 43% depreciation in the UK, 39% depreciation in the USA. So again, in America, this particular sports car seems to hold its money a bit better. The one thing that I would note, and it was actually a bit of a surprise to me, I would guess it's because people are buying these in the US sort of as second cars, is the mileage difference. I think in the UK particularly, I had a quick look through Europe and it was a real mixed bag. So I think Europe kind of acts as a middle ground between the UK and the US on this one. In the UK, people buy MX-5s as their everyday car. When I used to work at Mazda and sell an MX-5, it was actually quite rare it was to someone to have as a second car. A lot of people were looking for, maybe their children had no longer lived at home and they were able to go and get that sports car, but they didn't want to break the bank on it. Maybe it was someone who's a bit younger and they'd heard of MX-5s and wanted to try one and, take them for a test drive and they loved it. There was a lot of people who just were buying for their main car. Every now and again, there would be a second car person, but generally, actually, I would see them buying used, not new. So maybe that's more to do with it. But certainly in the US, it seemed to be a bit lower mileage. And because of that, the prices seem to be a bit stronger. Yes, you'll definitely be able to find variations on that, but that's running a regression on the prices that were up in September. So that was an interesting one for the MX-5. I think if you overlook MX-5s, you're overlooking an opportunity to have great fun in life. I honestly, I sold them brand new. Okay. So, obviously I've got some bias. I worked at Mazda, but I chose to work there because ultimately, look, I do not fit in MX-5s. The NC generation, which is the generation I sold, they were a bit bigger, but even so, I had knees around my ears and, it's all massive challenge to fit in those cars. But the driving experience is something I don't think actually we're ever going to get it back. I think we may be looking at the last time this is possible. Maybe Mazda of all companies may be able to do something in the next generation. Maybe they'll be able to offer sort of a small battery, hybridized engine that passes emissions and keeps the balance of the car, keeps the lightweight. But honestly, lightweight, rear-wheel drive, front engine, balanced chassis. I think safety laws, if emissions laws don't kill that particular type of car, safety laws will. Of course, we'll follow it up. There'll be a next generation of car. I'm sure it'll be electric or hybrid. But if you haven't driven an MX-5, preferably on a back road in England or one of the great country lanes in Wales or up in the Highlands of Scotland, or some of those few areas in the US where you have this sort of old school, slightly narrower twisting lanes, you're just missing out on an opportunity in life to really have a thrill on the road that I think less and less people are getting offered to them. But anyway, we'll move on to the next one. This one's a bit more of a brute and again has an engine that has now slowly gone off to die. It's the Audi TT RS model. So this is a 2.5 5-cylinder engine. It's the 8S chassis, 2017, 2018 models. I should point out there's buyer's guides for the MX-5, the NC and the ND generation, and there is a buyer's guide for this generation TT on the channel. So in fact, most of the cars on this list have buyer's guides on the channel. So if you like the sound of the depreciation, you think, oh, I wonder what the ownership prospect would be like. You can check out the buyer's guides after this video. There will be links underneath, and I'll try and put some stamps through the video as well. Okay, now, big power on a TTRS. 394 to 400. There is, depending if you're in Europe, the US, or if you're in parts of the world watching this that receive European specification cars because of emissions laws, they had to fit the OPF or GPF, so the particulate filter, into the exhaust exactly on the year I was looking at. And what I noticed was OPF cars, sort of particulate filter cars, have seen a sudden sort of uplift in their price because they are pre-filter cars, which means they'll never have to legally require one. And what you see in that, as I ran the pricing from my own sort of self, just to visualize it, I was like, you could just see this sudden dip up and then it dips down. I thought, was there a special edition? Was there something the factory announced? Was there a change in the engine construction? Because the earliest models, if we go back previous generation and into this generation, they have the iron block, and then you transition around 2016 different for different markets, but around 2016 to the iron block engines. And the iron block engines are, the aluminium block engines, from iron to aluminium. Aluminium block engines, generally more tunable. They're generally viewed as half a V10 engine because you can take certain parts out of a V10 R8 and they'll slot straight into the 5-cylinder. Now, I could go on a long, long rabbit hole, which I'm not going to on this, but the point of all of that is it was just funny to see the data set, which sort of showed a sudden uplift in prices. So if you're looking around here and you see, say, one's a 2018 January registered and others are June registered, and the January one has more mileage, but the owner wants more money, it could be something like that going on. It's quite funny when you see data sets like that. I don't know if I don't think I mentioned depreciation. 45%, okay, in the UK, 40% in the USA. So again, the US stronger depreciation, stronger values than the UK, where, as I say, nearly half the value gone. So I think because we're losing this 5-cylinder, it's had a stay in the RS3. It's been able to carry on for a bit longer than they anticipated. I know Audi dealers were preparing to sell the very, very last ones at the start of this year. And then there was a facelift and they said, actually, we're going to keep selling them. We can keep selling them for slightly longer. But TT RS he's gone dead and is not coming back. So there'll be a debate over whether it's a sports car. I think it is. All-wheel drive system, 5-cylinder engine. Go and drive one and make up your mind. The car after this is again one of those true sports cars, I think. And actually, kudos to the manufacturer because they built this car, engineered this car, created this car at a time when it was not obvious that it would sell. I actually think they came into one of the biggest headwinds they could possibly have done for a car market when they released it. And that is the Toyota GT86. We've since had the GR86, but the GT86, there's a buyer's guide on the channel. And around that 2017, there is Sion FRS, I think it is. There is the Subaru BRZ and the Toyota GT86. I would say there's not too much between them. Everyone knows sort of how they're built, and really we're talking about exterior bodywork, a couple of options, but reported 197 to 205 horsepower. At that 8-year-old marker, we're again looking 45 and 40%. So 45% UK, 40% USA. I was able to find some slightly heavier depreciated ones and some stronger ones. The data set on this, again, I think it reflects the market at the time. Toyota were going into some headwinds. There's not that many of them in relative terms to, other Toyotas that are out there, or even other sort of sports cars. And so because of that, you do see a little bit, I don't know how to put it, you see a little bit of a sort of a drop off over the years, but at the same time you see residual values strengthening. And I think that's to do with less and less of them. And as a car gets rarer, but there is still demand for it, then you've got the classic supply and demand scenario. So you have to be a little bit careful with how you look at if you want one of these. And of course, if you can stretch up to a GR86, my view, driven them both back to back, had the opportunity to do that. The GR86 really did answer. I'll tell you just one thing really, really interesting, really quick about driving cars. When you get to drive a lot of them, everyone on the internet, especially people that don't drive a lot of cars and talk about them a lot, they will tell you the stats are better, so it's better. And that is just a fool's errand of a game, okay? Sometimes cars that are not complete, as in, there is more that could be gained from them. The manufacturer could have possibly given it something here, or you have to drive around a problem in a car. It makes the driving experience. There's no other way to put it. We as humans look for flaws, and actually we cozy up to stuff that has flaws. I can't explain that, but if you've ever driven one of these, especially if you've driven a lot of sports cars, you'll find that the GT86, it feels like there could have been further done to it to make it a better car. The GR86 feels like it filled in a lot of that promise. It makes it a better car. But on the road, what you want is a challenge. It's why I think a lot of people, when they look at electric vehicles, they don't find them that desirable, because the challenge is gone. You press this pedal down, you go very quickly. the idea of challenging yourself, especially on a track or on a more challenging road, in a car that doesn't just give you power, doesn't just sort of almost telepathically show you this is the gear you need to be in, this is the power band you need to be in, this is how to get that corner, where you have to do some of it. It's very, very rewarding. And so, you know, because these are actually very competitive price against their sort of newer sibling, if you want to put that, the GR86, I'd be really tempted to have a drive of one of these. Some people will talk about flat spots and things like that, and yes, they exist. I'm not going to hide it. It's not a perfect car, the GT86, but it gives you the chance to really sharpen your skills of a driver to drive around an incomplete car. Now, the next car on the list, a little bit more complete in many ways. In fact, I think one of the best of this particular size of its generation. By the way, the GT86, like this car, does have a bias guide on the channel. The BMW M2 in the F87 generation in a 2017. And actually, 2017 is quite a sweet spot for this car. Now, when I did the buyer's guide, I had a few people push back because I said low budget pick, a standard M2, high budget pick, the Club Sport. The Club Sport is an exceptionally engineered vehicle. They really changed a few things to move it from great sort of fast road car to something that outperformed itself on a track. But because of that, some people pushed back and said, what about the competition? And I completely get it. Okay. Competition is probably the car for most people. It's the middle ground, but that isn't the low budget or the high budget pick. So power, 365 to 405 brake horsepower, 47% depreciation in the UK, 40%. And it's all, you know, 3 in a row there. I think, I'll be honest, I did round a little bit here because you had sort of like 41.40 and 41.5%. So the US didn't, you know, it's not bang on the 40, but you can get the idea. I'm giving you the rough figure. I think one of the reasons that we see a high depreciation on this particular car in the UK is they did sell quite a good number of them, especially the earlier sort of the 2016, that sort of initial year into 17. And then once the competition came out, it pushes the values down a little bit of the non-competition models. And then because, you know, Club Sport and everything else, and then the late models that sort of have special editions about them, I think people generally want the later engine. And there's this whole sort of criticism on the early M2s that they don't have a true M engine, but it's a true M car. It is. Go and drive one if you don't believe me. There's something that the BMW did with that chassis balance that if you were buying an experience, very little matches up to an M2 that is also, when you want it to be, a pretty regular car. Most sports cars have to start sort of really cutting into the compromise zone for other areas to get the chassis balance, to get the performance and the nosedive and everything that people want on a car when they're really pushing it. But you usually lose comfort, you start to lose a bit of insulation, you start to get some road noise, and you start to have a car that's compromised when you just want it to be an everyday car. The standard M2 doesn't do that. The competition does move further that way. Club Sport, you're way off. You know, you are really compromised for a particular goal. But again, you know, you're going to pay for that anyway. So I probably wouldn't be a pick on here. If you're willing to live with some compromises, the competition offers more power and sort of a complete all-rounder, but with compromised edges to it. The BMW M2 standard model really doesn't step into those compromises. And while it's not quite as complete overall, it's close. It's close, especially for this area of the market. Okay. On to the next one. And this one definitely has a buyer's guide because many of you have told me over and over again how when I did the buyer's guide for this and in comments to the videos, you said, oh, you know, this was one of the greats. How come you don't talk about it enough? And it pushed out its sibling. Okay. Maybe that'll give you a clue to what it is. Number 6 on the list is the Porsche 718 Boxster S, 2017. I'm going to get I can already sort of feel the criticism here saying, hold on, this is a 2.5 turbo, you know, it's a 4-cylinder engine. Why can't we look at the previous generation? Why don't you talk about the 4-litre? Porsches hold their money very, very well. So 350 horsepower, 8-year-old car, 47% depreciation in the UK, 44% depreciation in the USA. And I'll put a caveat to that. Specification on these cars can vary that figure by a fair way. I had to do quite a lot of sort of normalizing the data, because don't forget, any Porsche model, you can put a pretty hefty amount. You could probably double the price of most Porsche cars with the options that are available to you. I mean, paint sample alone, when it's available on in certain model years, can expand out to, you know, a third of the price of the vehicle base. So, you know, you've got to take all that into consideration with it. I tried to look for sort of the middle ground cars. Maybe they had 1 or 2 optional extras, a few things that might be important, PASM, something like that, but didn't have sort of some of the wilder options. And yes, I didn't go for the 4-litre model. It's a little bit newer, the GTS. And ultimately, you know, I had a neighbour that had one of these cars. I remember talking to him once, and I said, how compromised do you feel your car is? Because, you know, we were friendly enough for me to sort of say, look, I was a motoring journalist at the time working in the magazines, and I was like, what do you think? And he's like, look, I'm not you know, if you're not someone that is razor sharp keen on cars, you enjoy a fast car, you like the sound of a car, but, you know, you're not there at a Cars and Coffee every other week. You're not going to car shows up and down the country. You don't spend all of your free time on YouTube watching videos. This is probably one of the hotspot cars for you, because you can put an exhaust, say, from Miltech on it. You'll get a good sound from the engine. Is it true Porsche? I would say it is, because they've had 4-cylinder Boxster engines going back quite far into their history. Yes, there'll be criticism because people love the 6-cylinder, but actually, it's fair to say this company has a history with this engine. And on the 718, what you got actually was a more sort of livable chassis, really good torque and power, and actually reasonable efficiency. And I know that's not really the conversation for a sports car, but bearing in mind that some people, especially looking at Boxsters, are thinking more of road trip driving and taking them on long distance, and then having some fun when they get there and then driving them back, more so than just carving up country lanes, you know, on a Sunday. I think actually this is a pretty good pick, especially because it gets criticism. That's helped knock its price down. It's one of the weaker performers. Of course, the regular Boxster is even weaker performer. The Cayman, which this knocked out of the list because it would have been in a similar place and it didn't feel right to have basically the same car, you know, solid roof, convertible roof. That's preference. It felt wrong to have them twice in the list, and the Cayman does perform slightly stronger. So if you build from here and start going more and more desirable, you can start going higher and higher price. And I wanted to try and keep the list as fair on price as I could. Okay. Car after this one, though, probably a little bit more of a left field choice. There is a buyer's guide to this car, but it wasn't popular, and I knew that before I made it, but I liked the car, so I thought, well, I'd do a buyer's guide years ago, and it's made it onto the list because of those opinions that many people have about it. Has knocked its price down. The Nissan 370Z and Nismo specification. Now, you can see this on the buyer's guide. There is actually a couple of Nismos throughout the time period that it's built, and depending on the market and everything else. But there's quite a rare Nismo. That's the early one on the 370Z. Has a much smoother front end. And then there's the later Nismo, which is much sharper, much more angular. Okay, so yeah, you can see 2 different ones. One, they're both genuine Nismos from Nissan, but sometimes people get a little bit confused because they look so different. I sort of looked at Nismos, looked at the regular 370, 350 horsepower, so same sort of power, naturally aspirated engine. You know, this was a time when finding an engine without turbochargers became harder and harder. The fact that the 370Z served for such a long period of time, I think it did it do 12, 13? I think it did 13 years in the end, so it had a long service life. That maybe helped a little bit residual values, but in the UK, 48%. In the USA, 44%. This is after 8 years average mileage. Yeah, there's a few special editions on this car as well. I'm not going to say too much. I think the 370Z is a car people will judge themselves, and it's definitely a true sports car. That's what I'd say. It belongs on the list because it is a true sports car. It does bring in a few compromises because of that, but if it's all about driving pleasure, which it should be on a sports car, then we can't deny the 370Z as one of the hot picks. And actually, despite its weight and, you know, relative horsepower to weight and the way your sort of the chassis was balanced, again, I think this is a car a bit like the GT86 earlier. It's not perfect, but that actually makes it a better car because you've got to find that performance from it. You have to dig down deep into your skill set, and a good driver and a bad driver would be separated in a 370Z on track. Whereas some of the other cars, you know, TT RS maybe, where it's all-wheel drive, big torque, big power, a good driver and an average driver on track may not be so differentiated. Okay, so if you're looking at sports cars to really challenge you, the 370Z, I'd have a look at one of those. And now we're going into the deeper end of the list with number 8, buyer's guide for this car. And I say that it's a sports car. Some people would say it's a supercar, but because it's front engined, rear wheel drive, and because of depreciation, they're relatively good value. I think it's the most powerful on our regular list. It's the Mercedes AMG GT S. Pick the S model. Okay, there's quite a lot, and you'll see this in the buyer's guide if you watch the AMG GT buyer's guide. There's quite a lot to pick from. I went for the S. I think it's mainly because of production numbers. Okay, there are quite a few other variants, and I'm not saying that the S is definitely the best one. I think it depends on you a little bit more, but 503 horsepower, a 52% depreciation in the UK, and a 49% in the USA means half price. Okay, this car half price really starts to make a strong argument for itself, especially because some owners have treated it more like a supercar, and because of that, they've really spent the money keeping it perfect. I know some of you will argue it is a supercar. I think Mercedes, they didn't really sort of push the clarity on it. They put the big engine in there, but you can have this horsepower with, you know, a C63, for example. And they kept it more sort of aiming at Porsche 911 than they did going up to the sort of supercar territory. So I'm going to say it does belong on the list. And also, 50% off. This is a bit of a cracking car to drive for 50% off. I mean, it was a cracking car, brand new. I remember, I can't remember actually off the top of my head which one it was that we got, but but anyway, got to drive a couple of these. And the interesting thing was, in many ways, this shouldn't have really been a great car. And I explained that by saying, you know, the previous generation SLS had ended. Everyone loved that car. Gold wing doors, harking back to Mercedes history. Big, you know, 6.2 V8, thunderous sound. That really doesn't have a follow-up act, especially when you start to say, well, the next one's going to have turbocharging and it's going to, you know, lose some of this sort of classic styling and it's going to sort of fit a new era of Mercedes. And they pulled it off. There's something to be said for that. It's probably more of the comfortable end, I would say, although you can step up, and if you go for more hardcore models, then you compromise off a lot of the comfort for the handling. But Mercedes are quite good at this. They start off with a regime of going for comfortable and fast, and then as you move up the more hardcore models, you start to get in a sharper and sharper edge, but you lose that comfort. And again, it's like I said earlier, you start to find it's more of a weekend car that's compromised for the road rather than sort of that car that you could use pretty much any day of the week, any time of year. Maybe not in a snowstorm. The next car, number 9, I mentioned it earlier. It's a BMW Z4, but it's not the current generation. Okay, I looked for the very, very last of the E89. There is a buyer's guide for this generation and for the newer generation and the previous generation on the channel. So Z4 is your sport for choice. If you are interested in one, you can check out the buyer's guides. But I looked at the very last one. So they are, 9-ish years old. At the very end, you could get a 35 IS. They did 35i. 35i is 300 horsepower, and then 35 IS, 335 horsepower. So you do get sort of the power, or at least the claim power of the newer one, although it's fair to say the G29 generation, like the Supra, probably always outperformed its official power. But anyway, on the E89, this is one of those cars, it was built just at the time, you got to sort of go back to its original engineering, is that mid-2000s time. And BMW still had to build a car very true to the BMW ethos of ultimate driving machine. And as time goes on, they have to then up the performance, still make it drivable, and keep going and keep going. And at the very end, it's quite rare to find 35 IS models, 55% off in the UK, 50% off in the USA. You can find them slightly cheaper in the USA and slightly more expensive. There really are not that many around. The sample size was pretty poor for this very end of the run. I think ultimately people were waiting for the next model. But if that's you looking, they bring in something that forces you to drive. There's also a fantastic driving position on this. There's not many cars of this era, actually, that really didn't sort of compromise driving position. Okay. A lot of them had to, there was new safety rules coming in around the time. To keep the car going, you were going to have to sort of make sure the driver's seat was in the right position for sideways crashing, all this sort of stuff, and whatever else really sort of compromised some driving positions of cars. Z4 made sure that they weren't, BMW made sure the Z4 was not going to face that compromise. So if you're a bit longer legged, this, and you don't want to spend money on the latest one, go and have a drive of these. You will be surprised. You'll be surprised, especially if you've not driven many sports cars, how much driving with the back end you're doing. Because of how you're sat, you can feel, I'm driving with the back end of this car, and I've not done that before. It's fun. Number 10 on the list is, it was almost actually one of the worst performers, but then I found a couple of even worse performers, so this moved up. Jaguar F-Type, buyer's guide on the channel for this car. It's a V6S, so the S model, the hotter, but the V6, 380, 375 brake horsepower, depending on what year you buy, what market you're in. Again, filters and all that sort of stuff. 55% depreciation in the UK. You can get them 60% depreciation, but I'm going to stick with 55 because that's where sort of the nicer kept ones were. And then on the US side, I was a bit surprised. I think this has been some movement in prices over the last year. So 50% depreciation in the US. At one point, they were showing heavier than that. And I think there's a little bit of realization now that Jaguar have said they're not going to make this type of car anymore. Now that people have sort of had chance to really get good reviews on the V8 and said, look, the V8 is a thunder machine. But actually, the sort of driver's one, the sporty one, is the V6. And I think because of that, there's been a rebound in US interest, and that's solidified the prices a little bit more. So you might be able to find them a bit less, but I'm going to say 50%. After that, this is probably the car that you didn't expect to be on the list because you probably forgot they made it. Mercedes SLC. Okay, so the SLK comes out, it becomes the SLC as it's facelifted throughout the years. It's the AMG 43, so we're getting even rarer on this one. 367, 362 brake horsepower, depending on where you are in the world. This is one of those cars that most people just forgot was being made. Okay, so they are quite rare to find. It left a quite small sample size, but all of this means that not that many people pick them, especially 43 models. I think I've said it. I said it in the buyer's guide. The early ones of this had the V8. Okay, they had a naturally aspirated V8 engine, and Mercedes then drop it. It goes, they go 43, so it has 3-litre V6 engine. if you can get one of the shortest wheelbase cars, modern cars that you can buy with a V8. Really interesting if you buy the early ones. But that pulls a lot of attention away from the late models that were AMG 43s. And I think because of that, there's actually a little bit of a sporty bargain to have here. I think they're just so overlooked that actually spend a bit of time looking, have a drive of them. Yes, they're not going to be as sharp as the Z4 to drive, but they have their own charm, especially in this AMG 43. You can also, you can go for the lower spec ones. You'll get a great deal if speed isn't as important to you. But it took me, quite a bit of time to decide on this one. It was sort of one of those offshoots. I was like, no, I'm going to bring it in. There is a buyer's guide for the SLC model. And I thought, yeah, do you know what? A lot of people forgot about it. That could make it a great bargain for others. The heaviest depreciator on the list. So I have 2 wild cards to bring in, but the heaviest depreciation car. Probably no surprise if you think about it, but I think some of you might have put it into the supercar category, which maybe you could, but BMW i8, okay, the 2017, it's a hybrid 1.5, 369, 357 horsepower, depending on where you are, 67% depreciation in the UK, 62% depreciation in the USA. They have been, depending on who you speak to, they're either a great vehicle that's underappreciated or totally awful and pointless. And there's not many sports cars that cause such a strong reaction from people. And because of that, it's hit residual values. But ask people that own them, actually, you'll hear a different story. Okay. Yes, okay, it hasn't got some of the noise and the muscle, I would say, if you go for a bigger engine vehicle. Okay. But what it does have is actually quite a nice rasp from that 3-cylinder. Pair it up with the electric motors, it feels like something at the time was really looking ahead as to what sports cars could become. Was it a supercar? BMW probably would say it is. But realistically, I mean, the power is current BMW Z4. So, I'm going to say it goes in the sports car category. There is a buyer's guide for that, by the way. The 2 wild cards, I think one of them is a sports car. The other one I think is a supercar. Some people argue that they're both supercars, but the residual values on them were so comparably good, comparably bad, I should say, that I thought, actually, there's a few people out there that are going to say, oh, look, there's a sports car list of depreciation. Well, let me check it out. And at the end, they'll give you 2 and then you think, maybe I could actually step up to something that you weren't thinking about. So the first one, Aston Martin Vantage V8, the newer generation vehicle, the one that got all the criticism for the front end and how it looked and everything else. 528 brake horsepower, 503 in some of the very early ones. It's got an AMG 4-litre V8 engine. 7-year-old car, 58% depreciation in the UK, 55% depreciation in the USA. And while that doesn't make it a cheap car, it does make it pretty competitive to some of the newer sports cars on this list. And at the end of the day, it's an Aston Martin. It's got an Aston Martin badge. And for some people, that really has huge value. Also, some people will argue it's a supercar. I think Aston Martin themselves say, look, we do go up. We go up to the Vanquish, sort of Grand Tourer end. The Vantage was really their sort of Porsche 911 competitor. And the 911, especially sort of the Carrera end of the market, is still trying to be a pure sports car rather than supercar. So I'm going to say this is a sports car. And I think if you can step up price-wise, you may just be surprised at how much you can get for your money on a car that's still current, still being built at Aston Martin. Yes, it's been facelifted, and the facelift does a lot to take away some of those comments of the early looks. But if you can get yourself past that, buy one in a dark colour, it shouldn't make too much of a difference. They're actually really good driving vehicles, and quite a lot of enjoyment can be taken out of them. I think the Porsche 911 is ultimately the one that keeps the prices of these down, because you start to look at the Vantage and you go, or I could get a 911, and then people go and buy a 911. So the last car on the list, yeah, I'm going to admit that this probably is a supercar, but hey, for the price, you know, you're competing with sports cars. It's the Audi R8 V10. V10's gone, the R8's gone, but the first of that generation, the newer generation, there's a buyer's guide on the channel. 540 to 610 brake horsepower, 57% and 52%. So 57% UK, 52% USA. That depreciation means that these cars are not cheap. But for many of you who have a reasonable budget, may be able to squeeze yourself that little bit harder. And to get a V10 engine is, as someone who loves cars, I would say, worth it, because that's an experience very few people. You'd be surprised actually how few cars have a V10. How few people out there have ever been behind the wheel of a V10. I mean, I think on one hand I can count the ones. So I've driven R8, driven the M5 V10, and then I'm really struggling actually after that to think of another V10 that I've been. RS6 had the V10, and the S6 had the S6 had a V10. Yeah, the S6 had a V10. Managed to be in both of those. After that, I'm struggling. So you know, I've driven a lot of cars, and 4 are V10s. You know, that really should be saying something to you, that actually, and V10s have just such a fantastic howl to them. You know, you go out there you've had a bad day, it's been raining all morning, you've had a horrible day at work, and that evening you say, I'm going to just take my car out for half an hour. You get a V10 wound up right to the top of the rev range. You've forgotten about that bad day that you just had. So, you know, if that has value to you, it may be worth stretching a little bit. That is the total list. I hope you've enjoyed the video. There are buyer's guides to all of these, almost all of these cars on the channel. So if one or two particularly takes your fancy, go and check the guides out. Otherwise, consider subscribing, because so few of you do actually. I think it's like 1% subscribe to the channel. So yeah, seriously consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.